What is the relationship of time with our spiritual disciplines, with our spiritual practice? What effect do things like the seasons have on our discipline? What effect do things like the times of the day and the lunar phases have on our spiritual practice? And what are some of the traditional teachings in the spiritual traditions about this? This is what we're going to be looking at in today's episode. This is the second part of our short video series on the sacred sciences, and I hope you enjoy. When we talk about time in relation to spiritual practice, what we're really talking about is the way that pran, the way that life energy, responds to and is sensitive to certain major objects of time, such as the rising and so-called rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, the lunar phases, even larger calendrical cycles like 12-year synodic cycles and connections with Jupiter. Depending on how deeply you go into it, you can actually become very particular, or you can zoom out and look at huge calendrical cycles that measure the way that our life energy responds to these instances of time and this relationship to time. Some spiritual traditions, which focus a lot on pran, on the life force within ourselves, they often take great account of time. For example, many of the yogic methods and practices in India and in Tibet and in the Himalayas, as well as especially the Chinese internal alchemy practices, the Neidan practices of the Taoist tradition, because they focus so much on using the life force and shaping it and making it a part of their spiritual discipline. Those kinds of traditions often have far more respect for the influence of time on the movement of our life force. Whereas traditions that are a little bit more cerebral, or traditions that are much more devotion-oriented, either one, whether it's more heart-oriented or devotion or intellectually oriented, those systems, they don't necessarily need to take account of time in the same way, though often they still do in subtle ways. For example, traditions that are much more oriented towards prayer, such as many of the major religious traditions, Christianity, Islam, and others, still pray according to certain times. If you look at the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, you see that they have the various times of the day that the monks have to pray, and those remain constant. You can, likewise in Islam, they have the 5 salat that they do each day, according to the quality, the color of the light, and how light changes throughout the march of the day. There's even, very prayer-oriented traditions may still often use time to their advantage, use some of the special qualities in time to their advantage. But often, the less the life force is involved, the less time gets involved. Whereas the more the life force gets involved, the more time becomes something that we can take advantage of. You don't have to take advantage of it. Nothing in this video you have to take advantage of. But it's happening anyways. Your energy is responding to the movement of the moon, to the movement of the earth around the sun, to the changing of the seasons. This is actually quite obvious when you watch yourself, when you watch nature, and see how nature responds to the changing of seasons, see how even your garden responds to the changing of the seasons, the changing of the lunar phases. You can pick up a basic farmer's almanac and see for yourself the important role that the moon plays in when to plant and when to harvest. All these things, they don't just play a role in things outside of us. They even play a role in our minds. Oftentimes, people, their minds respond very powerfully to the lunar phases. Obviously, female bodies respond strongly to lunar phases. And even in the day, there are times where we prefer to sleep. There are times when we prefer to be awake, times when we prefer to be active. It's not always a rule for every single human being. But in general, we see that there are certain biorhythms and there are certain movements and rhythms of time which the classic spiritual cultures speak about as fluctuations in pran, in the life force, in our vitality. And that vitality is kind of the driving mechanism of all of this. And when vitality, when pran, when life force interacts with time, we get really what we call life. Life is a movement through time. And in particular, it's a movement of our life force, because in spiritual tradition, consciousness itself is essentially beyond time and space. So for consciousness, time isn't that big of an issue. But for our bodies, for our breath, for the function of our organs, for the flow of energy within the physical bodies, time becomes a factor whether you acknowledge it or not, whether you want to use it to your benefit in your practice or not. And in this episode, what I want to look at is starting with the largest unit that we're going to work with in this episode, which is the year and the seasons, looking at some of the classic teachings on this, and then getting closer and closer, smaller units of time where we move from the seasons to the lunar phases, the months, to the hours of the day. Trying to understand what role all these things play. How does our energy respond according to the teachings of especially India and China, which focus much more on the relationship of pran to time? And how can we take full advantage of that in our spiritual disciplines so that we can use it as a friend? We can use time as an aid, as a tool on our path, instead of unknowingly working against some of the properties of time in our spiritual discipline. Before I dive too deeply into the first increment of time that I wanted to look at, which is the year, I feel that something should be said about the concept of yuga cycles, of these much larger kind of epics or aeons of time that almost every tradition talks about. Buddhism talks about it, especially in Hinduism, has a whole lot of teachings on these aspects of time. So yuga cycles, they're huge. We can deal with kalpas, which are billions of years. We can deal with manvantars, hundreds of thousands of years. We can deal with, gradually smaller 24,000 year cycles, and so on and so forth. In most of the traditions that deal with time on those scales, they say that we're in something called Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is it's the dark age. It's to say that's a kind of dark age. Even though there's smaller cycles within that, so within a Mahakali Yuga, some people, for example, are familiar with the teachings of Shri Yukteswar, may say, actually we're in Dwapara Yuga, we're in a different time. But that's a little bit of a different measurement than what I'm looking at here. With the Mahakali Yuga, which began more or less the time of the events of the Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, we have a change that happens, and different traditions give different reasons for what this change may be. How is it that the quality of life can change based on these huge cycles that seem to involve things far beyond our planet, movements of our star around another star and situations like that? How is it those things can affect the quality of life here, quality of energy here? And I'm not really going to go into the depth of that, but I will say that what seems to be the case is in Kali Yuga, we become very cerebral society. So in Kali Yuga, individuality becomes heightened, probably due to a few things. One, due to the increasing size of the corpus callosum, which there's been some evidence to show when you look at old archaeological digs, when you look at old, remnants of the human species. It looks like back in the day, a long time ago, the corpus callosum was nowhere near the size that it is now. It looks like corpus callosum is actually growing in mankind, separating the differences between left and right hemisphere of the brain. But also we have very frontal lobe-oriented society. So there's a lot of imagination, a lot of dreaming, a lot of things, where we can look at a whole society and we can see that this is just a very cerebral society we live in now. The brain is functioning over time compared to kind of previous times where at least the cerebrum aspect of the brain didn't seem to play as large of a role. People had a much stronger sense of unity, stronger sense of community, a more decentralized sense of self. In Kali Yuga, the chief marker for Kali Yuga, for the Dark Age, is a very centralized idea of self, right? A very body-oriented, individual-oriented society, which we see increasing more and more. And because of that, the classic teachings, especially in Hinduism, say that this is why Bhakti Yoga, which means devotional practices, are so important during Kali Yuga. I would add to that, it's also why Jnana Yoga, why things like Advaitic teachings flourish so much in this time. So if we look at Advaitic teachings like Buddhism and the Advaita of Shankar and Ramana Maharshi and others, which have become so prominent in today's society, and we look at all the world religions, which have devotion as their core, as opposed to necessarily more scientific methods. They're much more oriented on prayer and heart and, adoration. All these things meant to kind of, they help strongly decentralize your ego. They're not very cerebral activities. Things like crying and losing yourself in prayer and feeling lots of love. These aren't particularly cerebral activities. These are things that engage deeper parts of the brain, deeper parts of our kind of psychological anatomy and neurological system than just the cerebrum itself. And those parts of our brain, like the medulla and others, allow us to kind of, I think, experience a vaster sense, a more decentralized experience of self. Whereas when we become very cerebral, our sense of self becomes much more concrete, much more focused on the one that's doing the thinking. When the thinking isn't that big a part of society, when thinking isn't actually that important, it seems like we have a more unified experience of things, which I think is why many of the spiritual paths focus on getting over the mind, getting over this kind of cerebral way of life, so that we can experience more clearly something a little bit more decentralized. And so spiritual practices that help decentralize our sense of self end up becoming very prevalent in Kali Yuga and this time. So we're kind of, in the midst of a huge Kali Yuga. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of years left of it. On a smaller scale, technologically wise, we're kind of out of the Dark Age. But on a large scale, we're still within kind of this Mahayug cycle of Kali. So this plays some role in the sense that we have to be mindful of. We have to be mindful that one of the main obstacles for any spiritual practitioner in Kali Yuga is that the personality becomes a little bit dangerous to work with. The personality is so strong, so individualized, so concrete. Whereas apparently, in previous yuga cycles and previous world cycles, the personality is not this strong, right? They're what we call higher cycles, where a sense of individuality, at least, is not the same as our identity. Maybe there's identity, but there's not as strong a sense of individuality around it. Whereas in Kali Yuga, individuality is so strong that practices and disciplines which help us break through a little bit our sense of self and activate parts of our brain, parts of our psyche that have less to do with our personal identity, right? Things like losing ourselves in devotion, or practicing overcoming the mind, cutting through it with reasoning until we get to a no-mind state, like in Jnana Yoga and Buddhist practices, Shamatha Vipassana. So we can experience more of a unified state of being that seems to have been more the norm in previous ages. So this is the first increment of time that we just kind of have to be mindful of as spiritual practitioners, is that in Kali Yuga, you can't necessarily just practice a bunch of things which strengthen your mind and your energies without also simultaneously being aware of the fact that the personality is a little bit more of a problematic thing in Kali Yuga. Our sense of identity is quite strong. So if you give yourself a lot more energy because you're doing all these practices, but your individuality and personality is still very, very strong, then you're going to find you're just going to get more angry about things and more sad about things and even more joyous about things. But all the emotions, they're going to become exaggerated because you just have more energy. Because the personality is still very, very strongly intact. And by personality here, there's nothing wrong with having personality. I don't think any spiritual tradition thinks that's wrong. It's more particularly the ego is what I mean, right? This very strong sense of separation between yourself and the rest of the world that then becomes the basis for your personality. I don't think in higher ages the personality is as big an issue. But when we have such a centralized ego, such a centralized idea of self, it does seem to become a problem. So this is the first unit of time that even someone doing things like Nedan and yoga, they have to be careful because they can just be increasing the strength of their ego instead of increasing their spiritual discipline, instead of actually making decent spiritual progress. They can be kind of undoing themselves. You may make good spiritual progress in one way because you feel better, your energy is flowing better, and you've had some interesting experiences. But you've actually kind of denigrated the spiritual path itself towards moving. Instead of moving towards oneness, you've moved towards total strengthening the individual more. So this is kind of this first unit of time, the Kali Yuga. Now, moving from these huge yuga cycles, we're going to skip a few smaller cycles and move straight to the year. Now, when we look at the year in our spiritual discipline, we have a few things to be mindful of. In particular, we have kind of two sets of information to be mindful of. One is the course of the sun. Is the sun in its northern course, meaning from winter solstice to summer solstice, or is it in its southern course, from the summer solstice back down to the winter solstice? This plays a role partly in how the energy moves. In the Vedic system and in yogic systems, we have the 6 months of the northern course is likewise followed by a 6 month, or kind of imitated, mirrored, by a 6 month movement of pran up the 6 chakras that are inside the body, the Shat chakras. And then the 6 months of the southern moving course of the sun is the movement of the pran down, back down those 6 chakras returning to the root, to the base. And there's different spiritual traditions and practices which take advantage of that movement through the different chakras and the different parts of the Sushumna Nadi, of the kind of central spinal cord and its pranic equivalent. We also have, on a little bit more of a relatable scale, because the chakras are very deep and can be difficult to work with, we have the changing of the seasons. So aside from this northern course of the sun and the southern course of the sun, we have the movement of the seasons. The way that the seasons affect us, there's different teachings on it, but the ones that I think tend to be the most intuitive and easy to grasp, and which I'll be using in this episode, are the Chinese teachings. The teachings are the Taoist teachings, medicinal teachings, that deal with the movement and how the different organ systems and the different tissues and tissue systems within the body are affected. So when springtime comes, beginning with spring, we have the liver energy becomes very active. So the teachings on this, like things in the Yellow Emperor's Classic, say that at this time now, during wintertime, you're not supposed to do a whole bunch of physical things. It's better for just quiet meditation. But when springtime comes, now it's time to begin moving, begin stretching. Activities like yoga and Tai Chi are very much encouraged during springtime, because the energy is one of new birth, of stretching, of spreading out, of beginning, of getting the blood moving, loosening everything up, limbering everything up, and engaging in more activity, more physical activity and psychological activity than you may have during wintertime. And as well as taking advantage of some of the extra energy that's present there in springtime, especially if you meditate in the morning, which is the time of day that relates to springtime within those systems. So when springtime comes, this is, of course you can keep your root sadhana, your main sadhana that you do every day. But it's also good to add things like herbs that are very dispersing and warming and nourishing to the tissues. Get involved with basic exercise routines, start to nourish the sinews and the tendons, which relate to the season of spring, and to the liver. Make sure to take care of the liver, drink some teas and things that are good. It's a good time for like a liver detox. And then spiritual disciplines that involve some kind of movement, especially those that stretch and help support the ligaments and tendons, such as yoga, especially Hatha yoga with all the asanas. Asana yoga is very nice during springtime. And then also things like Tai Chi even is quite nice, because it moves, it stretches, and it nourishes and strengthens the sinews and the tendons. So this is part of the energy of springtime. We move from spring into summertime, then now the energy of the heart becomes active. So this is very much, emotionally with summer, it's important to have a lot of joy. It's important to go out and go on vacation, see new places, meet new people, laugh a lot, have fun experiences. All these things very good, very nourishing for the energy of the heart, which in turn becomes nourishing for the rest of the body during summertime. In terms of spiritual discipline, you can get much more physical with things. You can meditate a lot more. There's a lot more fire to work with in the atmosphere, a lot more energy. So it's good for things like tumo and pranayama, things that really practices that raise your fire a lot, get you sweating, circulate blood very strongly. And in daily life, it's a good time of year to be doing a lot of exercise and jogging, working out more, actually working with the muscles more. Those kinds of activities we have more energy for in summertime. So normally we would say, like in Taoist tradition, that in summertime you should be sleeping less and moving much more. In spring and fall you kind of sleep regularly and move regularly. But in summer you're particularly active. Whereas in the opposite of that, in wintertime you relax a little bit more, you sleep longer, you take it easy, you retire earlier in the day. In summertime you're supposed to stay more active, kind of follow the movement of the sun more. So while the sun's up, you're more active for a longer period of time. When we move from the kind of that powerful solar energy of summer into fall, then now the energy of the lungs become much more active. The energy of the lungs really good again for things like breathing practices and pranayama, as well as, because it's the metal season, metal practices in Taoist tradition, things like standing postures and such are very good. Or asanas, where you hold the asanas for very long periods of time to let the energy settle into particular frames of movement. These kinds of things are very good. It's a good time for reflection, for thinking about life, for starting to transition from a lot of physical activity into more deeply contemplative and meditative activity. And then when we move into wintertime, now we have all the energy kind of retreating more from the outer limbs. Okay, so in summertime, we can say that the blood and the pran is flushing out through all of our flesh, all of our body into the extremities, instead of being locked away in the organs. Whereas in wintertime, the blood and with it the pran, the energy, the life force, moves deeper, more interiorly into the body to focus on nourishing the organs. So likewise, trying to do a lot of physical activity during wintertime can be seen as being destructive to the limbs and to the tissues, because the tissues have a harder time getting blood and nutrients from the Taoist medicinal perspective, have a harder time getting fresh vital energy and blood to the limbs during winter time. Whereas if you turn inward towards deep meditation, things like meditating in Dantian or doing spinal breathing, or things like Vipassana and Shamatha training, where it's very mental, very training the mind, turning inwards, this kind of energy where you're sitting still for long periods of time is much more supported by the energy of wintertime. Whereas in summertime, if you try to sit for long periods of time, you may find that you start to get very antsy, the mind starts to move, you start to get kind of restless leg syndrome, and you just want to get up. You have a hard time sitting like that. It's because all the energy in the blood is now moving through the extremities. So the arms, they want to move, the legs want to move, the body wants to move and do things. And so because of this, it can be a little difficult to sit for long periods of time completely still in the middle of summer. Whereas in wintertime, it can be difficult to maintain constant physical activity. It ends up being much easier to sit, to relax, to retire a little earlier in the day, to do less physically demanding work, turn inwards, be quiet. Quietness is a very important part of the wintertime aspect of following the energy. So this is, in some old Taoist traditions, called the macrocosmic orbit. And most people, unfortunately, nowadays, through Qigong, things like that, when they hear the phrase microcosmic orbit and macrocosmic orbit, they think of particular energy movements within the body. And while that's certainly true for martial artist practitioners, they have ways of strengthening the body through moving the energy in these orbits. In terms of our own internal energy system, if we look at some of the old writings like the Western Assembly and such that are dating, 500 AD, 200 AD, at the beginning of internal alchemy in China, we can see that the macrocosmic orbit meant the actual orbit, the movement of energy, the movement of life force throughout the entire year, and how we can live in a way that is in harmony with the natural movement of energy through the seasons, so that we experience full health and full energy all the time, instead of practicing in a way where sometimes we unknowingly put the movement of energy through time against ourselves and against our own practice. So therefore, to complete the macrocosmic orbit actually takes a year. It requires that from springtime to springtime, you kind of live accordingly in each season and make sure to nourish the respective organ. So the organ for wintertime is the kidneys. The organ for springtime is the liver. The organ for summertime is the heart. The organ for fall, for autumn, is the lungs. And in the midst of each of these seasons, the spleen and stomach partake of it a little bit as well, meaning you need to be always watching your diet, always regulating yourself. But then there's certain emotions and certain expressions that are better at different times of the year. So if you're more interested in that, I advise you look into things like Yellow Emperor's Classic and some of the Taoist teachings on the passage of time throughout the year for the seasons. From the yogic perspective, we have this deeper movement of the northern course and the southern course of the sun. And this, I imagine, unlike the seasons, which are different for the northern and southern hemispheres, though I've never seen any teachings saying that the northern and southern course would be different for the northern and southern hemispheres. I imagine really they'll be the same, because it's less about the seasonal influence of the movement of the sun. And when we look at how the energy moves through the chakras over the course of 12 months, it's less about the seasonal exchange of energy than it is about the actual direction that the sun appears to be moving in the sky throughout the course of the year, from solstice to solstice. So I think that the movement of energy through the chakras, where really 2 times a year the energy is merging in the heart, which is at the equinoxes. And then at the solstice, it's on the opposite ends, the opposite extremes. I imagine that'll more or less stay the same, whether you're in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, whereas obviously the seasons will change depending which one you're in. So this is just some very introductory things. We could do a whole video just on the effect of the seasons in the northern and southern courses of the sun. But I think for a simple video like this, this is enough about the year. Moving from the year to the month, when we look at the month esoterically, we don't mean the measurement of time like on the Gregorian calendar, where, April 1st, March 1st, so on and so forth. Instead, what we mean is actually the lunar month, beginning with the new moon and ending with the new moon, right? So there's this nice kind of 28 to 30-day cycle was the basis for a lot of the old calendrical systems. I think, to knowledge, at least off the top of my head, we have the Hindu calendar still follows at least the lunar solar calendar. The Islamic calendar is totally lunar. And the Chinese calendar, I think, is also lunisolar, which means the Tibetan is as well. So lunar solar meaning that there's definitely solar markers. There's what we call the agricultural year of the movement of the four seasons. That's somewhat similar to the Western calendar. But the first day of the month is always determined by the moon, right? By where the moon is, the pt, the lunar day. So the energies of the lunar days have played an important role in all the old spiritual traditions and are still playing quite an important role in even many of today's spiritual traditions. We can look and see the influence of the moon quite clearly. Obviously, for many female practitioners, they'll see that their own menstrual cycle begins to line up with the moon. The more in harmony they become with the kind of energies of time and the flow of their life force. But anybody can see the response that they have with the moon. My mother is actually an emergency room nurse. And when she was an emergency room nurse, I remember all the time as a child, anytime there was a full moon, she would work night shift, and she would come back the next morning. She'd be exhausted, and she always complained. She hated working in the emergency room on a full moon night because she said it was just, they were completely overwhelmed. They had way more people flooding the halls and waiting in the waiting room. They had people with a lot more psychological disturbances popping up on those nights. And just what happens is, the full moon, it exaggerates our energies, our tendencies. It makes our blood fuller, from the classic perspective, nourishes our blood, makes our blood very full, and nourishes our energy, makes our energy very full. And so it's kind of the summer equivalent of the lunar phase, where we have this very bright, strong energy that gives us more energy. But whereas the sun is a little bit more physically oriented, the moon's more psychologically oriented. It has strong effects on the Earth's magnetic fields. The brain is largely a magnetic device and responds strongly to these magnetic fluctuations of the lunar cycles. So we can actually, as spiritual practitioners, take advantage of this a little bit. We can take advantage of how the moon moves each month. And there are different times and parts of that movement where the degree of the light that the moon is reflecting is seen as being auspicious. And there are certain parts of that movement where the quality of the light the moon is reflecting is seen as being less auspicious. And so by certain observances in the lunar calendar, fasting on certain days, eating on certain days, changing our meditation practices a little bit, depending on where the lunar phase is, we can get the most out of this monthly cycle with our own practice. So with the full moon, starting there with Purnima, the full moon, we have this fullness of energy. So whatever is happening, whether it's negative traits, positive traits in you, these things are going to become exaggerated and increased by the power of the moon. Some people are far more receptive to that, and some people are less receptive. And what ends up happening, we have more energy to work with. So there's great time for kind of the equivalent of summertime meditations, right? It's a great time for circulating energy strongly throughout the body, going into meditation retreat where you have all this extra energy to work with. Good time for staying up all night, doing all night long vigils, things like that. You'll find it's much easier to do an all night vigil or even to fast at around the full moon than it is to do it around the new moon. You'll find if you try to fast or do vigils on the new moon, which is actually still quite encouraged in many traditions, you'll find it to be psychologically much more difficult, even physically much more difficult, because the energy of the moon isn't quite supporting you the same way. So some schools and traditions take advantage of that as well, because they want to get into deeper, more problematic parts of their psyche, which can only happen when you're kind of tired and exhausted. So they might push themselves more on the new moon. If we want to circulate energy for health and things like that, the full moon's an excellent chance to take advantage of that energy, circulate it strongly throughout the body, things like breath work and yoga, standing postures, tai chi, whatever your method is. Circulate energy, keep the energy hot, right? If you're a good practitioner, you should know what that means, right? That when you're practicing, it's like a firing process, and especially in the evenings, you'll become quite hot. The energy really flares up, especially on full moon. You take advantage of that, and it's also a good time, like I said, to do something like a vigil, because you find it's much easier to stay awake all night and focus on your practice. So it's a good time for a retreat as well. You take advantage of that extra energy. With the new moon, on the other hand, it's better for quiet meditation, better for stillness, better to not do a whole lot of physical activity or near the same level of physical activity if you can. I realize some of these guidelines are pointless for people's jobs and lifestyles, but apply what you can into it. It's a good time. It's like the winter of the month as opposed to the summer of the month. So likewise, the kidney energy, the blood and the prana that's moving throughout the limbs very strongly during the full moon, by the time the new moon comes around, it's kind of retreated deeper into the body again. So obviously, this will pair with things like the seasons quite strongly, where a full moon during summertime is going to be this very energetic time for practice, whereas a new moon during winter time is going to be particularly kind of debilitating and weakening and exhausting. And so as a practitioner, you may want to be more mindful and take more herbs during that time, eat more nourishing foods, not just during winter, but during a new moon, especially new moons and winter time. Eat more nourishing food and make sure you're taking good care of your body, resting plenty, getting a little bit more sleep than normal. Whereas by the time, as the moon gets brighter and brighter, you can start kind of pulling back a little bit on how much sleep you need, increasing the activity that you're doing each day. And depending on your spiritual tradition, even your sadhana, your practice can change a good bit. There are some traditions that really focus a lot on, you practice every single day at this time with this method, regardless of what time of year or season it is. There are other ones that have a very organic, moving approach to spiritual discipline, where the practices they do week to week may change substantially depending on how the energy of the atmosphere is. And like I said before, a lot of that comes down to what level of self that tradition is working on. The more energetic traditions that deal a lot more with the physical body and physical health, rejuvenation, and circulating energy and blood throughout the body are going to have to pay way more attention to movements of time. Whereas traditions that are going deeper into the psyche, deeper into aspects of ourselves, though they can use time to their advantage, aren't necessarily as subservient to it. Within the month, we have a few kind of special days that have classically been deemed as days where we can do particular observances and take advantage of the energy there. So for one, we have what really should be called the actual new moon. Normally in Western terminology in English, the new moon is when it's totally dark. We should just call that a dark moon. and the new moon should be when the first sliver of the moon appears, the first time you can see that sliver of the moon, which classically, like in Islamic tradition, for example, that's how you start the month, is someone has to testify that they saw the sliver of the moon after it had been totally dark. So that energy there, astrologically speaking, spiritually speaking, is the beginning of a new cycle. So it's an auspicious time to start new things. It's an auspicious time to start a new habit. If you try to start a new habit on the kind of Western astronomical new moon when it's totally dark moon, the energy isn't really there as much for it. Whereas once the energy starts to be born with the lunar phase, and we get that first sign of the sliver of the moon, this is like the beginning of a new lunar cycle, the beginning of a new phase of energy. And so we can use this a little bit to form some aspirations and make some changes to our psyche, enact some new habits. There's many different levels of ways we can use this for our spiritual discipline, depending on your particular tradition, with different oaths or particular practices that follow lunar cycles. Initiations, all those kinds of things are often timed with this kind of first true lunar day where you first see the sliver of the moon. We have the Ekadasi fast. Ekadasi is the 11th lunar night, which is seen as having a particular spiritual quality where sometimes when there's a lot of spiritual energy in the atmosphere, it can be overwhelming to the body. And if you eat at that time, it can actually overwhelm the body's energy systems in a negative way. So because of this, some traditions will even say that this night, this 11th lunar night, is actually negative. There's actually a lot of spiritual blessings in that night if you stay up, do vigil, meditate, pray. But classically, you fast on Ekadasi, full 24-hour fast from sunrise to sunrise, with the night between those two sunrises being the 11th night. And has a wonderful kind of resetting effect on the energy, very purifying effect on the energy system. And I think one of the things it does, it makes you more receptive to the fullness of the energy of the full moon, especially when you do the Ekadasi fast. That's a few days before the full moon. And then the dark night Ekadasi fast, which is a few nights before the new moon, is a little bit more about purification and penance and quiet and stillness. So these are two 24-hour fasts normally observed throughout the month. We also have the 4th lunar day, 8th lunar day, and the 14th lunar day that are normally, there's just a fast during the daytime and instead of during the night. So there's some kind of quality about the moon's energy and how it mingles with the sun's light during the day that is seen as not being good for digestion and for the physical processes, physiological processes of the body. So it's better to allow time for the body to reset itself, renourish itself, rejuvenate itself at those times. So these are some ways we can apply the cycles of the moon into our spiritual discipline. And the last cycle of time that I want us to look at in this episode is the projection of, or the movement of energy throughout the day. So the day largely imitates the season. So we can, just to help understand better the quality of the day, we can roughly break the day into 4 seasons, 4 kind of magnetic or energetic seasons, and say that midnight, true midnight, meaning, the actual opposite of true noon, which may not necessarily be the same as when you just follow the clock. True midnight is the winter of the day. Sunrise is the spring of the day. Noon, true noon, when the sun is actually at its zenith in your area, which you may need to calculate on your own. True noon is the summer of the day. And likewise, sunset is the autumn or the fall of the day. So we can take the same teaching, some of the same principles that we're talking about for the year, and we can project it onto the day. For example, we can say that the morning, because it deals more with the liver time energy of spring, is good first thing in the morning to, have some tea or something to clear out the liver, do some stretches, some asana or some tai chi, qigong, whatever you want to do. Move, stretch a little bit, exercise gently if you want to, and to help get the energy flowing, right? The kinds of spiritual practices you may want to be engaging more with in the morning are things that help warm up and nourish the body, circulate the blood, and kind of stretch and harmonize the tendons and sinews. Summertime, the summertime of the day, being high noon, might be a better time for really getting a lot of work done, focusing on your work, doing the daily chores and everything that you need to do. Most people are going to be at their work at that time, so they're going to be either very physically involved or psychologically involved at that time. And if you get a chance in the middle of the day, there's a lot of spiritual energy in just sitting totally quiet at that time, because the energy is so full. If you just sit quietly, you'll find that it becomes very harmonizing, rejuvenating. Then the sunset is kind of the fall, the autumn of the day. So it's a good time for things like pranayam, circulate, do breathing practices like qigong and pranayam, circulating the energy through the body, slowing the breathing, controlling the breathing, and harmonizing the lungs. And then wintertime is the kidney time of the day. So it's a good time for sitting quietly, being still, doing deep meditation throughout the night. These kinds of things, more like the wintertime practices. So you can apply this throughout the day. And then likewise, obviously, because the moon has somewhat of a relationship to the seasons as well, you can do that. But I want to talk about, too, a kind of special quality of the day, or a special time of day that has a kind of sacred quality talked about in a lot of different traditions, which is the 2 hours or so before sunrise, kind of beginning just before civic twilight, when the first bands of light begin appearing on the eastern horizon in the morning, but you can still see stars in the west. This is kind of the very beginning of civic twilight in the morning time. And this forms what's called the hour of Brahma, the hour of God, a kind of divine or sanctified time. And in many spiritual traditions, this energy has a special quality to it, has special energy to it, a special kind of blessing in it. If you can wake up and practice during this time or do your prayers during this time, meditate, the energy is something about the quality of the sun's light before the sun has actually risen, has a very refreshing, very nourishing and rejuvenating effect, not just on the body, but on the mind. And so this is kind of an ideal time to practice each day, kind of right before sunrise. Conversely, right after midday is not a particularly good time to practice. So the hour or two after true noon, after the sun passes its zenith, is kind of seen as just, it's the hottest time of the day, the driest time of the day. The energy can often be very oppressive. That's the time of siesta, normally. That's the time where you should take a break a little bit. You start yawning. You start kind of crashing from lunch or from the caffeine of the day. You kind of slowly start to have your afternoon crash. You start looking at the clock regularly at work, wondering when you'll be done. That's that energy of that time of day. And it's not a particularly good time for spiritual disciplines and practice. Whereas if you pay attention, you'll see once the sun sets in the evening, there can again be kind of a refreshing energy, kind of a refreshment of the mind and body that can happen. That is also a good time to practice, and midnight is especially a good time. So these are some of the aspects of the times of the day. We have the 4 seasons, and then I think we should be mindful and add this 5th time of this kind of divine Brahma Muhurta, the divine hour before sunrise, that we can take advantage of the kind of rejuvenating and refreshing energies at that time. And with this concludes our teachings on the extension of time and how we understand time, the movement of prana, the movement of our life force through time in the year, in the month, and in the day. So I know it's a little bit longer video than normal, but I hope you enjoyed it and were able to hopefully learn something you can apply. You know, with all these episodes, I'm always trying to be as universal as I can be. I'm trying to talk about things that I feel will be useful for people from many, many different traditions, but as always, apply the kind of inner logic and structure of your own tradition, what you're learning, to what I'm talking to here. Don't override your own path's teachings on certain things just because you like the video, right? Be mindful of that. But hopefully everybody from many different traditions will be able to find something useful in these teachings. So this concludes the second part of our series on the esoteric disciplines, which is the way that the esoteric disciplines and sciences integrate time into practice. I hope you enjoyed.